Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's new digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris is one of the world's foremost Jewish advocates. Today, David will share his personal Jewish story, from the development of his Jewish identity to the journey that led him to AJC. After we hear from David, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ali, and hello to everyone from New York. I chose to call this talk An Improbable Jewish Journey because it was improbable, and I wanted to share my experience, especially during the holiday season of Passover when we talk about stories. In my case, it was improbable because people think that, well, if you work in the Jewish world, you probably were rooted in the Jewish world from the very beginning. You probably went to Jewish nursery school, Jewish day school. Well, I did not go to Jewish nursery school or Jewish day school. Oh, you probably went to Jewish camp. Well, I didn't go to Jewish camp either. Well, you probably spent time at Hillel in college. Well, in fact, when I was in college, I entered the Hillel building once. Actually, I'd like to say twice, the first time and the last time, because it was a religious setting and I was not religious. So I didn't feel particularly comfortable there. Well, perhaps you had something at home, Shabbat dinner or something. Well, in fact, I'm almost ashamed to say I did not have my first Shabbat dinner until I was probably 22 years old and was invited to a home in Westchester County. And I was really clueless about what was going on. I had no ability other than to try and lip sync. So it wasn't a probable Jewish journey in the sense that many of my colleagues in the Jewish world did go through Jewish day school, Jewish summer camps, Hillel, Jewish studies courses, and a kind of framing at home. On the other hand, it's not that it was completely empty desert in my first, say, 20, 22 years. There were some things I now realize in retrospect that still kept me anchored. The first thing was my mother. My late mother, who passed away some 18 months ago. My mother could not speak Hebrew. She did not know the prayers, but she was profoundly, steadfastly Jewish. She never wanted to be anything else. For Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, she knew her place was at the synagogue, the B'nai Jeshurun on the west side of New York. She sat there from beginning to end. She kept asking the people next to her, what page are we on? Because she couldn't follow the prayers in Hebrew. And I dutifully went with her because I didn't want my mother to be alone. My mother also taught me something very important at an early age. Again, it took many years to understand it. And that was, we'd have people coming to our apartment door every so often to raising money for this or that cause. And it included some very Orthodox Jews from Israel, raising money for their yeshiva, for example. And we were a rather poor family. My mother was divorced. She worked full time. She had very little money. Money was always an issue, but she always found a couple of dollars for those people. And when I asked her, Mommy, why? We have very little money and they don't look like us. We don't look like them. She said to me, we're all Jews. We have a shared destiny. They may look different and perhaps act different than we do and we than they, but as a survivor of the Holocaust, I know one thing: we're all Jews. We have to support one another. And without perhaps realizing at the time, I internalized the message: we are one people, Am Echad, and our destinies are intertwined with one another. I also grew up with another blessing, and that was my whole entire immediate family was within walking distance on the Upper West Side. And that began with my maternal grandparents, who literally lived in the next apartment. We were in 6B, and they were in 6C. And they were profoundly Jewish. Again, it wasn't expressed in traditional ways of observance, but they were proud Jews. They were Zionists. My grandfather got the forward in Yiddish every morning. And I absorbed it. I was in their house probably every day. And by the way, if today I could wave a magic wand when we all talk about Jewish identity, I would urge, beg, and plead for all grandparents to live as close as they possibly can to the grandchildren, because grandparents may be the best transmission belts for identity. They certainly were in my case. I had my maternal great-grandparents within a few blocks. I had my only aunt and uncle. I had my paternal grandparents, all within this kind of Upper West Side cocoon. They were all Jews. So no, most didn't observe, but they had stories to tell. So if you asked me at the age of 10, 12, 14, what does being Jewish really mean? I would probably have said, it means having a story to tell. And the story would involve multiple countries, and it would involve escape, and it would involve hiding, and it would involve fighting back. It would involve many languages. I remember friends from school coming over to my house, and my mother and my grandparents speaking to each other and to me in one sentence, in perhaps French, Russian, and English. My friends looking at me puzzled, like, what's going on here? And to me, it was the most normal thing. Being Jewish meant speaking many languages, most with an accent, coming from other places, having some really difficult stories, adventures to tell. I also grew up on the Upper West Side, which itself was quite Jewish. You had a large Italian community, you had a large Irish community, you had a large Puerto Rican community, you had a fairly large African American community, and you had a Jewish community. And we were all sort of one Upper West Side, but within that, there were the subcultures. There was a very strong Jewish subculture. It was built around food, and was built around synagogues, and was simply built around, you know, who's Jewish, playing that game, Jewish geography or whatever. And I realized I absorbed much of this. And so as I look back and ask, well, I didn't have the traditional Jewish education, but somewhere inside me, there was a spark. Only later, I learned the Yiddish word neshama, or in Hebrew, neshama, the word soul. But I realized somewhere inside me, there was a link. There was a link to that identity, to that chain that my family of 4 generations represented, and those who came before them. And I grew up at a time when lots of Jews were leaving the reservation, if you will. They were seeking other religions, they were seeking cults, they were seeking radical political ideologies. I stayed anchored. I may have been in the minority at the time, and it reminds me of a joke told then of an elderly woman in New York who went to the travel agent and said, you know, I need to go to this remote part of India. And the travel agent warned her that it was going to be a very onerous trip. Maybe she should reconsider. She said, no, 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 I must do this. So he booked the long flights and then the trains and then the buses to this remote site. And she got to her hotel, and the guides explained to her that the next day she would have to walk up this steep mountain to reach the guru, but there'd be many people online to see this much sought after guru. So she'd only be allowed to say 3 words to him. So the next day she trudges up the mountain with great difficulty. She waits her turn. Finally it's her turn. She's standing in front of this world famous guru, and she looks at him and she says, Sheldon, come home. That's the era in which I grew up. And yet I never left home. No matter what I didn't know, I still somehow knew viscerally that my home was the Jewish world. That was very much reinforced by reading 2 books. The first at a very early age, and that's this book right here, Exodus by Leon Uris. I was probably 14 or 15 at the time. I needed a lot of sleep in school. But I remember sitting down to read this book one night, and I didn't stop until I finished the book the next morning. I pulled my first all-nighter. The book gripped me. It transformed me in many ways. I became admiring of the Israel that was being built, of the kinds of people depicted in the book, like the Ari Ben Kanans. And it began to appeal to me. And then came a second book, which came a few years later, which I just happened to find on the shelf one day when I was at the London School of Economics. It's called While 6 Million Died by Arthur Morse. Now, my family, with very few exceptions, had all managed to arrive in the United States either just before the war or during the war, in the case of my mother, or after the war, like my father. The story that this book told, though, was the story of a different America, a very different America than the one I so deeply loved. It was an America that essentially turned away so many Jews seeking refuge in the United States during the 30s, during the 40s. The ship to St. Louis is perhaps the most famous, but there were many more stories told by Arthur Morse. And again, I remember sitting, reading this book and not being able to put it down until I had finished it, and being shocked to realize that my family had been so lucky, but how many others had been denied entry into the United States. This was something almost inconceivable to me. In 1971, when I read the book, I also made my first trip to Israel. I wanted to go to Israel, but I also wanted to visit France and Italy and Spain and Greece. So yes, Israel was on my bucket list, but it wasn't necessarily at the top of my bucket list. But I got there. And I remember almost from the first moment, feeling somehow emotionally transformed. Sure, France was beautiful. Italy was exciting. Greece was spectacularly wonderful. But Israel pulled at me. It touched me. It found my neshama, my soul, my neshama in Hebrew. And it held on. And I looked around at a country that was exciting, that was building, that had a purpose. And I was coming from a country and a generation which had kind of felt a loss of purpose and a loss of meaning. So many people were cynical and angry and skeptical about where America was in the late 60s and early 70s. And here was this country which to me as a newcomer, romanticizing and I'm sure idealizing it perhaps, but nonetheless that grabbed me in a way that I hadn't expected to be grabbed. The next year, 1972, was also part of what emerged as this really decisive decade, the decade when I was in my 20s, and that transformed me from someone who was kind of marginally involved with a spark inside me, perhaps, to someone who became fully involved with that spark lit and raging, if you will. 72, I started working after I got my master's degree at the London School of Economics. And I worked at the AFS, the American Field Service, which sort of reflected my idealism about the world. It was an international educational and cultural exchange. It did lots of wonderful things in the nonprofit sphere. But I discovered after being there for a little bit that one country was missing, obviously missing from the roster of nations involved, and that was Israel. And I found myself kind of puzzled. Why was Israel missing from AFS, from this idealistic global organization smack in the middle of New York, by the way? And then I discovered that AFS appeared willing to pay the price of the Arab boycott because there were Arab nations involved in the AFS programs. But presumably the price for their involvement was no involvement by Israel. I was shocked. I was the new kid on the block. I had no power whatsoever, but nonetheless, I found myself actually advocating for the first time. Unsuccessfully, although years later, long after I left, Israel was brought into the program. Something else happened in 1972, which also began to shape my identity. In my own mind, no one else's mind, I assure you, I was a would-be Olympic athlete. One of my big dreams was to march into the Olympic Stadium as a member of an Olympic team. Well, 1972 was the year of the Munich Summer Olympics, and I was watching it avidly. And then 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were murdered by terrorists. And I was shocked, I was appalled, and even more so when I saw the bumbling German reaction, and even more so when the International Olympic Committee almost tried to sweep it under the rug, lest it become an inconvenience to the idealized image of the Summer Olympics. Again, what was going on here? Why were Israeli athletes and coaches treated differently than everyone else? And then came the pivotal year of 1973. I was in synagogue with my mother for Yom Kippur, again, the twice-a-year observance. And all of a sudden there was a murmuring. And then the rabbi announced from the bima, from the stage, that Israel had been attacked by Egyptian and Syrian forces. Again, I found that this touched me much more than I ever expected. All the more so having been in Israel 2 years earlier and seeing the faces of young Israeli men and women in uniform and wondering what their fate would be. And to my own surprise, the next day I called the Israeli consulate to volunteer for the IDF or for any position that they might offer me. And here, immodestly, if you allow me, I have to take some credit for Israel's eventual victory in that war. And the reason is simple, because the Israelis rejected me for service. Had they accepted me, I'm not sure what the outcome might have been. But I then had to ask myself the question, if I couldn't go to Israel and help in some way, drive a truck or something, I was an only child and Israel would not accept only children into service. What else could I do? What was the role of an American Jew in such a situation, other than following the news? And then I realized something very important, which really, though I wasn't yet a full-time advocate as I have been the last 45 years, I learned something which has applied ever since. Richard Nixon was the President of the United States. The issue came down to whether the United States would or would not resupply Israel with needed spare parts to wage a war that was longer than anyone anticipated in Israel. Would Richard Nixon make that decision or not? Now, Richard Nixon was not popular in the United States, and he was certainly not popular among Jews, and he was even less popular in my generation. But at that moment in time, Israel's very survival and ability to win the war depended on the decision of Richard Nixon. That's when I learned my advocacy lesson. If I really and truly care about the well-being of the state of Israel or the Jewish people, then I have to understand the need for access to whoever is in power at a given moment. We don't get to choreograph or script how things unfold. Fortunately, Richard Nixon made the right decision in that case. I've never forgotten the lesson. I've tried to apply it ever since. In 1974, I took it a step further. I had a chance to go to the Soviet Union. I spoke a little bit about this in my earlier conversations on Soviet Jewry. I don't want to rehearse them. Again, these months in the Soviet Union were extraordinarily formative to my Jewish identity, primarily because I met Jews who were targets of cultural genocide. Now, I had been one of those young people who sometimes wondered if I had been in the Second World War, would I have had the courage of my father? My father, who served first in the French army, and then who was in labor camp for 3 years, escaped, and then served as an American spy behind enemy lines with OSS. Would I have been a partisan? Would I have been a coward? What would I have been? I realized, of course, that these were empty questions because I could never answer them. But when I came to the Soviet Union and saw what was happening to Jews who wanted to be Jews, I realized this is the challenge of my generation. It's not enough to shed tears on Yom HaShoah, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, or on a visit to Auschwitz. The real question was, here were Jews being targeted for elimination in a different way, not through labor camps and death camps, but nonetheless with the same goal. Would I respond? And then along came a girl about 14 years old in school number 45 in Moscow, where I taught. And one day she passed me in the hallway and she grabbed my hand and she put a piece of paper inside it. I immediately clenched my fist and I went off into the bathroom and into a stall and I opened the piece of paper. And it said, David Harris, I feel you're a Jew. If I'm right, please know that my family are refuseniks. Would you come visit us? Now, in the Soviet Union in those days, this was all about suspicion and potential entrapment. How did I know this was for real? But I took a chance. I felt I had to. And they were refuseniks. And I met them and I met others. And it had a profound impact on me to meet Jews who looked like myself, who could have been my mother, who was herself born in Moscow, or my grandparents who were born in Belarus. But there they were. I now knew. I could not claim I didn't know what was happening to them. Would I respond? And I responded after I was expelled from the Soviet Union in December of 1974 by going to Rome, Italy, one of the 2 transit points in Europe for Jews who were successfully able to leave the Soviet Union. And I began working for the first time in the Jewish world. I wanted to help those Soviet Jews, and I wanted to prove to myself that I had learned some lessons of history during this process. But then, was this going to be a kind of Jewish Peace Corps experience? Okay, I'll do a year, 2 or 3, feel good about it, and then move on, as one member of my family said, and get a real job. But you know, being there every day, meeting with Soviet Jews of all kinds and all backgrounds, from all over the Soviet Union, it gave me a sense of meaning and purpose. I mean, if the goal in life is to find meaning and purpose, the question is asked, what's the purpose of life? And the answer we're told is a life of purpose. I found it there in Rome, Italy. I found it each and every day trying to help in some small way Jewish refugees in the 1970s who were fleeing oppression and seeking freedom. And something else happened that year, 1975, that also profoundly transformed me, and that was I met my future wife. Some of you may know Juju. Juju was born and raised in Libya. She's one of those forgotten refugees, Jewish refugees from the Arab world, the hundreds of thousands who were victims of persecution and exile who are never talked about these days. She and her family had moved to Rome. Now, I had met many Jews in my Upper West Side cocoon in New York, but I had never met a Jewish family like Juju's. Parents and 8 children who were Jewish head to toe, 24/7. Their genetic makeup was Jewish, 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 and it was expressed in every way. It was expressed religiously, it was expressed culturally, and it was expressed Zionistically. For them, Israel was not a hobby. It was not, I like Israel because I like the leader, or I don't like Israel because I don't like the particular leader. Israel was in their mother's milk, and it was no accident that 2 of Juju's siblings made Aliyah and still live in Israel. So eventually marrying Juju brought me into a whole new world of Jewish identity. And the last straw in 1975 came toward the end of the year when the UN, another organization like the International Olympic Committee that I had once revered, adopted Resolution 3379, the infamous Zionism is Racism resolution. How could the same body that in 1947 endorsed sovereignty for the Jewish people subsequently deny the Jewish people that very sovereignty by claiming it's a form of racism? And when I went back to England later to continue my graduate studies, I learned that the Jewish Student Union in Britain had been defunded by the National Union of Students because it supported Zionism in Israel. In 1976, though, I was still in Rome. And here was the game changer for me. In meeting so many Jews from the Soviet Union, thousands and thousands of them, someone asked questions about Jewish holidays or Jewish traditions or Jewish beliefs, Jewish values. And more often than not, I didn't know. I didn't have a formal education. I didn't have a grounding. I hadn't read a whole lot of books. And so in order to stay a step ahead of these refugees, after all, they had an excuse why they didn't know. What was my excuse coming from New York? So in a pre-internet age, I began trying to learn more about my own tradition, thanks to Soviet Jews. It ended up with my actually writing a book, a rather thick book called Yivrei Mir, literally means Jews in the world, translated though as the Jewish world, and it's a bilingual book in English and Russian on an introduction to everything Jewish. Jewish beliefs, Jewish holidays, Jewish values, Jewish history, Jewish personalities, go down the list. And in writing this book, not only did I suddenly feel enormously enriched, I also felt cheated. I asked myself, why was it that until now I didn't know this? Where was my Hebrew school till I was 13? Where was our, if you will, marketing? What an extraordinary tradition. And I thought back to those in the late 60s and early 70s who, as I said, left the Jewish fold. Why did they leave the Jewish fold? Because they insisted they were looking for community, spirituality, purpose, meaning. Oh my gosh. From my life experiences up to that point in the Soviet Union, in Italy, in Israel, from my research on this book, we, the Jewish people, had meaning and purpose and community and spirituality in spades, but the connections had not been made. And so more than just being an external Jew fighting our enemies, the enemies of Israel, the enemies of Zionism, the enemies of Jews in the Soviet Union, I began to understand much more the why, the what, the content of what it is we were defending, why continue this millennia-long experience. And to fast forward, my AJC colleague, Steve Bain, was also someone who deepened over many, many years that understanding and that knowledge, and I will always be grateful to him. Let me skip ahead to 1978, which was a very important year as well for me, because two big things happened. The first was, by then I was in Vienna, that first arrival point for Soviet Jews, and lots of delegations came through from the United States. We had members of Congress coming, we had journalists coming, we had all kinds of Jewish groups coming. But I remember so distinctly one group in particular that stood out, that seemed to ask the smartest questions, to be the most serious, that didn't rush to pull out their Kodak Instamatic cameras to take pictures of everything. And it turned out they were from AJC. At the time, I knew nothing about the Jewish alphabet soup other than HIAS and the Joint Distribution Committee and the Jewish Agency, which were operating in Vienna and in Rome. But at the end of that meeting, the leader of the group, Ira Silverman, the late Ira Silverman, said to me, if you're ever in New York, why don't you come see me? Let's talk some more. And I pocketed his name and his phone number. And lo and behold, as you'll see in a moment, in 1979, I did go to see him in New York. The other thing that happened in 1978, which also sort of shaped that Jewish identity, which had evolved over the decade and shaped it big time, was Juju and I decided to get married. And we decided symbolically, let's get married in Vienna. Let's get married here 3 decades after the Holocaust, which after all was also engineered from this city as it was from Berlin. And so we went very eagerly, enthusiastically to the chief rabbi of Vienna. I think he was also the only rabbi. It was a small community at the time. And we said, Rabbi, we'd like to get married. And somehow we expected at least a smile, if not a warm welcome. And we got something quite different. We got a very cold welcome. We were met with a lot of suspicion. And in the ensuing hour, he was asking us one question after another, trying to prove our Jewish identity, our Jewish authenticity. And then he insisted that we go back and get documents from the United States, and in my wife's case from Rome, and have them officially translated and notarized into German in order to convince him that we were both Jews. Now this somehow struck me as wrong. What kind of a message was this sending? Here were 2 young Jews in Vienna. There was certainly no line of young Jews outside his office wanting to get married at that time. We were in Vienna because both of us were working with the migration of Jews from behind the Iron Curtain. We were surrounded on a daily basis by Austrian police and special operations units with fingers on the trigger because of the terrorist threat. My wife, as I described her family, was Jewish from head to toe. And I came from Jewish New York. And so we gave up. But we still wanted a Jewish wedding. We wanted to be married under a chuppah. We knew we wanted to have a Jewish family, however it was going to be defined. And so from Vienna, I called my mother in New York. I called her collect in those days through the operator. And I said, Mom, how do you get married in New York? And I remember she said to me, look, I tried it once in 1946 with your father. It didn't work out very well, so I'm the last person you should be asking for advice. I said to her, Mom, I'm not asking you for substantive advice, only for the mechanical advice. You know, how do you do this? And she ended up discovering how it was done. You go to City Hall, you get a marriage certificate, you then go to the synagogue, the rabbi marries you under the chuppah, wonderful. And she found us a synagogue on the west side, Stephen Wise Synagogue. It was a liberal synagogue. To us, it really didn't matter whether it was liberal, it was Orthodox. Again, we had that idealized notion of Am Echad, one people. And it turned out that who was the rabbi? Sally Pricant. Who was she? The first female ordained rabbi in the United States. Now, some people think you were making a political statement, David and Jewry. In reality, we weren't. We simply wanted to get married. But yes, at the end of the day, we were making a statement. And the statement was, every Jew should be welcomed into every Jewish setting. And the way we were received in Vienna was exactly the wrong way, the turnoff. We need to be a welcoming community. We need to have our tent open, not closed. We need to be accepting, welcoming to new people, whoever they are, in order to make them feel closer to us. And in the case of young Jews, to make them feel that we are indeed Klal Yisrael, one community of the Jewish people. So in 1979, after we got married in New York at Stephen Wise Synagogue, I went to see Ira Silverman. He offered me a job. My wife and I spent a few days thinking about it. Should we go back to Europe? Should we stay in New York? I took the job. I've been with AJC since 1979. It's now 41 years. And I've been given the biggest gift of all. And one of the reasons that I wanted to share this story is because I wanted to share that gift in the hope that for some who are watching this, maybe it will trigger some thoughts as well. The biggest gift I've been given is finding meaning and depth and enrichment and empowerment and understanding in being part of this extraordinary chain that goes back millennia. The Jewish people's journey through history, with all of its ups and downs, with all of its high points and all of its tragedies, that being anchored in this community has given me my meaning and purpose in life. It's allowed me to discover Jewish values and to live by them. It means operationalizing notions like we find on the Liberty Bell, proclaim liberty unto the land and all the inhabitants thereof. It allows us to operationalize notions like tikkun olam when we speak about them in the synagogue. It allows me to operationalize Jewish concepts like tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shalt thou pursue, or Isaiah's vision of a world at peace and a world in harmony. Being Jewish has given me that connection to my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents. It's given me that link to my history. I know where I fit into the larger scheme of things by being anchored in that Jewish history, while at the same time having been born, blessedly born in these United States and being a proud American. And by the way, understanding how much the Jewish experience informed the initial founding of the United States and how much the American experience has informed the Jewish journey, including that journey of pluralism. So I'm a happy person. I'm a fulfilled person as a Jew, as an American Jew, as a Zionist, as a friend of Israel. And yet, as I began, this was an improbable journey. But I want to end with my hope, which was not found in Vienna in 78, but found in New York in 79, that we will be a welcoming community, that we will understand that every Jew and lots of non-Jews have their own journeys in life, which at some point will intersect with ours. When that moment comes, my hope is the tent will be open. Ali?
Thank you so much, David. Just want to remind our audience that if you'd like to submit a question for David, you can email questions, that's questions plural, at ajc.org, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. David, our first question comes from Mindy from St. Louis. Mindy wants to know, as a lifelong friend of Israel and head of AJC, it seems that one's biggest Jewish challenge might be when the American Jewish community disagrees with actions of the Israeli government. How do you decide for yourself when to criticize Israel publicly or privately and when to hold back? And more broadly, you've expressed concern about what ought to be the role of American Jews in commenting on Israel. Can you expand on that, especially in regard to ideological comments from the right and the left?
Sure. Thank you, Mindy. So my starting point is a love of Israel, ahavat Israel, a love of Israel. And maybe in a way, it was a non-Jew who expressed it best for me. And for those of you who know me, you won't be surprised that that non-Jew was the one and only Winston Churchill. And let me quote from what he said. "The coming into being of a Jewish state in Palestine is an event in world history to be viewed in the perspective not of a generation or a century, but from the perspective of 1,000, 2,000, or even 3,000 years." I say that, Mindy, because this is my starting point. My starting point is not simply, as I said earlier in my comments, do I like this particular Israeli leader or not? I start with the belief that Israel must exist. Israel has a fundamental right to exist. That Israel is the expression of the Jewish people's quest for sovereignty, for national liberation. That like other peoples on earth, we too have that right. And Theodor Herzl gave it modern expression with the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And the United Nations took it the next step in 1947 when it recommended the creation of a Jewish state, its word, alongside an Arab state. Yes, we could have had a two-state solution as early as 1947, but it wasn't to be. So that's my starting point when I look at Israel. So when I encounter other people who talk about Israel in modern political terms, I want to understand as well what their starting point is. Does it come from a deeply rooted belief that Israel is a legitimate state, that we have the right to national self-determination? Or is it something more superficial and quixotic and driven simply by daily events and political ideologies? So that's the first thing. The second thing for me is I'm an American Jew. In 1976, as I mentioned, my wife and I went to Israel together, and we thought about making Aliyah, in fact. And if I can just do an aside for a moment, in 1976, we really thought about making Aliyah. It was such an exciting country to witness, but we didn't. And people ask me why. And I jokingly blame it on an Egged bus driver. Egged is the national bus company of Israel. It was the eve of a big holiday, and all the buses were going to shut down. And my wife and I were at the Jerusalem bus station trying to catch the last bus that would take us to Kibbutz Geva, where one of her sisters was a member. And if you know the word balagan, the bus station was a balagan. People were rushing in every direction, trying to get on those last buses and not wanting to be left behind. So my wife and I were standing there online waiting for that last bus that would take us up north. And all of a sudden, I see the bus doors close and the bus start to leave. And I'm standing there and I look around and Juju is nowhere to be found. The next thing, I see her on the bus frantically waving at me from inside the bus and then going to the bus driver. Well, he stops. He very imperiously opens the doors and parts the seas and comes to me. And he says to me, "Are you David?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Follow me onto the bus," which I did. And then he says to me, "David, I have one piece of advice for you. Don't ever make Aliyah. You will never survive in this country. You cannot stand online and expect to get on the bus." So we didn't make Aliyah. I say that for purposes of intellectual humility. There is a fundamental difference, I believe, between people who live in Israel and people who live outside of Israel. All of us outside have a choice. We can board a plane, well, maybe not today with the coronavirus, but we can board a plane, we can go to Israel, we can make Aliyah, we will be welcomed. Yes, the tent is open in that respect. We can live, and then we can then act on our politics, left, center, right, whatever they may be. I think those of us who've made a conscious choice not to make that decision should exercise a bit of humility. And that's where I have my differences with the hardcore left and the hardcore right. The hardcore right, from the safety of the United States, wants to ensure that Israel never trusts any Arab anywhere, and therefore makes peace, because the peace will always be a false peace. So bring the Masada complex with you. By that measurement, we never would have had the peace treaty with Egypt or with Jordan, or the prospects of deeper relations with many other Arab countries. And conversely, the far left, apologetic for Israel's very existence, always demanding a higher standard for Israel's behavior than any other countries, always accepting all the benign statements of Palestinian leaders while blithely ignoring those statements that may challenge their hardcore beliefs. The far left wants Israel to make peace at pretty much any price. Well, they have the rights to their beliefs, but I'd urge them to take those beliefs, live in Israel, serve in the IDF, put their children in the schools, live with rocket fire from Gaza, and then I respect whatever conclusion they reach. So I believe that, yes, we have the right to speak. Yes, we are supporters of Israel, and we're not going to support blindly if we disagree with something. And yes, AJC has disagreed on issues, but we think carefully. Is this a disagreement worth airing? If so, is it worth airing privately? Because we have very good channels to Israeli leaders. Or is it something that should be said publicly? If it's said publicly, what impact might it have on the larger image of American and American Jewish support for Israel? So I think the challenge here is to act responsibly, to act with a certain degree of humility, and to act non-ideologically. If there were easy choices for Israel to make, we would have peace by now. But we're 71 years into this conflict, nearly 72. Some will even measure in terms of a century. There are no easy answers, not from the right, not from the left. We ought to exercise a bit of humility.
Thank you, David. Our next question comes from Mario Fleck in Brazil. Mario wants to know, what has been the high point and the low point of your tenure at AJC?
Well, it's easier to tell you what the high points are, Mario. I think there have been a couple of high points. The first one that comes to mind was 1987 and the Soviet Jewry March in Washington on the eve of Soviet President Gorbachev's a visit to President Reagan in Washington. As I mentioned in the earlier sessions on Soviet Jewry, we had 36 days to organize this march, and I was given the task of being the national coordinator while I was at AJC. And the biggest Jewish demonstration in Washington history had been about 10,000. And we were petrified about whether we would end up with few people and send a message of weakness to Gorbachev. But Sharansky came along and he prodded us and he urged us, and we responded. And my proudest moment, Mario, was standing on that stage, looking out at over 250,000 people, Jews and non-Jews, Americans, Canadians, and others, who came together on a cold December day to say one thing to President Gorbachev: let my people go. It was an extraordinarily proud moment, and became even more so when President Reagan invoked the march the next day in his meeting with Gorbachev. And within a short time, millions of Jews began to leave the Soviet Union. We had made a difference, and we had proved in some way, yes, that we had learned the lessons of history. Low point. I think the low point for me was an effort that we tried several times to merge with a couple of other Jewish organizations that should have been logical partners for us. The Jewish world is not necessarily a well-planned business world. I suspect the Harvard Business School would consider it a case study in inefficiencies. And without going into detail here, Mario, though next time I see you, I'm happy to tell you more. We tried on several occasions to merge in order to create greater efficiency and less duplication and redundancy. And in each of those cases that I was involved with, and there were at least 3, The other side pulled out for one reason or another. It was a huge disappointment, and to this day, I still regret that the mergers did not go through. Ali?
Thank you, David. Our next question comes from John Feiger in Washington, D.C. He says, the Austrian government recently announced that they would offer Austrian citizenship to the descendants of Jews who were forced to leave Austria during the Holocaust. Like David, my father was able to leave Vienna in 1939. David, are you considering applying for Austrian citizenship? Do you think that the Austrian government will actually grant citizenship, and would you recommend that members apply?
Well, when you hear my answer, folks, you'll think this was a planted question. It was not a planted question. I grew up with a father who hated Austria. I mean, hated Austria. Even more, if that were possible, than he hated Germany. He hated Austria because he was living in Vienna on the eve of the war, and he has vivid memories of how he was expelled from the Institute of Chemistry, where he was doing work on the synthesis of the heavy hydrogen atom at the age of 17 and 18, by the way, for which he got an honorary PhD 40 years later. But he remembers shining the boots of Nazi officers on the streets of Vienna. He remembers Austria during the war, when they were as bad as, if not worse than, the Germans themselves, he believed. And he remembers Austria after the war, when for 45 years it hid behind the Moscow Declaration, which allegedly called Austria the first victim nation of the Nazis, not perpetrator nation, victim nation. So he died in 1998 hating Austria. So I never, ever would have thought of seeking Austrian citizenship. But in recent years, Austria has dramatically changed, and I've been particularly impressed by Sebastian Kurz, whom some of you may have seen when he came to the AJC Global Forum in Jerusalem in 2018 as the chancellor of the country, and he's again the chancellor, and how he dramatically shifted Austrian policy towards its past, towards anti-Semitism, and very significantly toward Israel. And after watching this for a couple of years, I responded to Sebastian Kurz, who himself said to me, I'd like to offer you Austrian citizenship. And to my own surprise, I heard myself saying, now I can accept it. My father is not here to judge it. I'd like to believe my father would understand it. But I wanted to close the circle in a way. It began in 1938 with the Anschluss, and my father's escape from Austria to France. And it ended nearly 82 years later with my now having an Austrian passport. So will the Austrians, John, give passports? I believe they will. They have a new law which may apply to you. Would I recommend it? I wouldn't dare. It's a very personal decision. Again, had it not been for the experience of recent years, I wouldn't have gone close to getting an Austrian citizenship. It's not enough just to have a cool passport in your pocket to show off. This one has a lot of meaning for me, and I suspect it would for you too.
Thank you, David. Our next question comes from Barbara from Palm Beach. David, you often speak about and have also written about Jewish peoplehood, including that there is a fundamental difference between Jews as a people and Jews as a nation. How does one reconcile two sides of Jewish identity, statehood and peoplehood? Do you ever worry that we give up our core values too much for the existence of a state?
Well, first of all, when I hear the words, do you worry, I kind of mentally stop right there. And my answer is yes, I do worry. I'm Jewish, I worry. The two go together, hand in hand. This is a really tricky one. I'm very glad you raised it, Barbara. Thank you. And yes, I've tried writing about it. And this is really the clash, if you will, or the inherent tension between we Jews as a people and we Jews as a sovereign state. And the two reinforce each other, they nourish each other, but they're not identical. They can't be. So if, for example, I go to synagogue on Friday night in wherever, New York or Los Angeles or Boston or wherever, and I wrap my arms around the person next to me pre-coronavirus, and we sway together, and we sing Oseh Shalom, and we talk about the need to repair the world and to pursue justice, and all those extraordinary ideals that have driven the Jewish people for thousands of years. It's very hard to come out of that synagogue setting and to deal with the news coming from the Middle East, where Israel as a sovereign state is, yes, the expression of those very same values. Lord knows those values were developed not in New York City. They were developed there and in nearby exile. It was in Babylon, wasn't it? According to Psalm 137, which, by the way, was President Harry Truman's favorite psalm. He used to say, "By the rivers of Babylon, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion." But how does the state reconcile those core values with the nitty-gritty realities of the often difficult, sometimes amoral, not immoral, amoral decisions of statecraft? For example, those decisions about, yes, on the one hand, we value human life above all else. On the other hand, if a terrorist in Gaza is in a car and is alone, do you take out the car? Well, I think the answer for most people would be, yes, you do. If it's a known terrorist and you have reason to believe that he has and will commit acts against you. What if he's sitting with his wife? Do you still do it? Do you not do it? What if he's with a bodyguard in front? What if he's with a child in between his wife and himself? You keep asking all of these kinds of questions. And maybe, again, for the deeply ideological, the hardcore on either side, there are easy answers. But for the rest of us, there are no easy answers. How does Israel pursue statecraft while being aligned with Jewish values, but in a part of the world where not everyone follows the same values? Hamas does not follow the same values. Hamas publicly celebrates death. And it says, in fact, as Hezbollah says, that the Jews' Achilles heel, the Israelis' Achilles heel is our love of life. Yes, it is. We affirm life. So I think sometimes those judging from afar are not willing to make that transition from the beauty of that Shabbat setting and the linked arms singing Oseh Shalom or Lo Yisagoy El Goy Cherev, a nation shall not lift up sword against nation on the one hand, with the nitty-gritty reality that Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur, that Israeli kindergartens are being attacked, and that the responses are not neat, simple, clean, and pure. They can't be. So in our own minds at AJC, we've tried to find the balance in each and every one of those situations. And for others, however, they don't find the balance, and I think that that's an unfair assessment and burden put on Israel's shoulders too often. Yes, Israel makes mistakes. Don't misunderstand me. Any nation makes mistakes. Statecraft is an imperfect science at best. The United States has made enormous mistakes, but nonetheless, the United States, like Israel, is a fundamentally good and decent country that affirms life and seeks to protect life against enemies that don't always view things the same way.
Thank you, David. We'll take our last question from David Ginsburg. David wants to know, what is the most pressing issue that AJC is tackling today? And what do you hope will be your AJC legacy?
So thank you, David. Well, I mean, today is probably an unfair question because all of us are simply trying to make it through the coronavirus like everyone else and hoping and praying for solutions. But the day before the coronavirus, yes, during, and the day after, for us, the biggest concern is the resurgence of anti-Semitism. That it seems that with the passage of time, with the Holocaust sort of fading into sort of distant memory, as we live in an increasingly ahistorical society, as the survivors of the Holocaust, the members of my own family, everyone older than myself, the liberators, the eyewitnesses, all go to their eternal rest. And as social media becomes this propellant that allows anyone, anywhere to take these noxious ideas and put them out there for the whole world to see. And where too many of our young people in today's world don't have the necessary critical filters to sort out what's real and what's not, what's truth and what's post-truth, if you will. I worry about the resurgence of anti-Semitism. It's been our biggest priority at AJC. We were the first to call it out in Europe in 2000. We were the first to call it out from its multiple sources, including jihadist, left-wing and right-wing. We were the first to call on governments to take on the responsibility for fighting anti-Semitism and not leaving it to Jews alone to do so. And now we've seen that anti-Semitism cross the ocean. Just as the pandemic has crossed oceans, so has this virus of anti-Semitism crossed oceans, and we're coping with it here. And that's our biggest challenge, and it involves Israel and Zionism and classical anti-Semitism and neo-Nazism and jihadism, all of it, and we're trying to take it all on. My legacy, I simply hope that people, to the extent that they will remember these decades in which I was involved with AJC, that they will be able to say that he gave it his all, emotionally, physically, intellectually. He gave it his all. He tried to make a difference, and he tried to prove that we had and have learned the lessons of Jewish history. Thank you all for being with us. I give it back to you, Ali, but not before saying Chag Sameach for the remainder of the Passover holiday, and good health, of course, to everyone.
Thank you so much, David, for that inspiring discussion. Thanks to our audience as well for joining us, as well as our partners at Jewish Insider. Moedim l'simcha, happy Passover, stay healthy.